Well, welcome everyone to the Alum Fellows reading series here at the Hutchins Center. And in this series, we welcome former fellows to this Hutchins Center to discuss their forthcoming or newly published works. So we are delighted today that alum fellow Susanna Ashton has returned to us with A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. We are also fortunate to have another former fellow, Greg Hekimovich, serve as the discussant. Greg Hekimovich is professor of English at Furman University, the recipient of many honors and fellowships, including one from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he's the author of several books, including the award-winning The Life and Times of Hannah Crafts, which you can see behind me, propped up on the bookshelf. Susanna will read from her book, then she and Greg will engage in conversation, and this will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. Greg, would you like to start?
I'd love to. Thank you so much, Krishna. And I'm so excited to be back with Susanna Ashton. Susanna Ashton and I are in a writing group. When I moved to Greenville, South Carolina, 6 or 7 years ago, we immediately just hit off. We had coffee, and our families had to try to break us up because we just couldn't stop talking. So it's a great pleasure to know Susanna, to know the just amazing work that she did on this book, and to be able to give you a just quick introduction to Susanna. And Susanna is going to share about the book, and we may have a little bit of back and forth conversation and then open up conversation with everybody. Susanna Ashton's professor of English at Clemson University. Her work's been profiled in the New York Times, CNN, the Wall Street Journal most recently, and other media across the country. She's authored, edited, or co-authored lots of titles. I'll just share a couple. Collaborators in Literary America, 1870 to 1920. These Colored United States, African American Essays from the 1920s. The South Carolina Roots of African American Thought. Approaches to teaching, Charles W. Chestnut, and then there's other work. She's an extraordinarily productive scholar. This book, A Plausible Man, is an extraordinary archival achievement of bringing fully to life just an amazing figure from our past that many of us didn't know about. So I'm very, very excited to welcome and introduce Susanna Ashton.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. Yeah, Greg and I have been thick as thieves for years with our projects in conversation, and sometimes in conflict, and sometimes really commingling sort of methodologies, and sometimes really going disparate directions. So, but always in conversation. So it's been great, and I appreciate all those kind words, Greg. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to fly you through a very brief sort of presentation about the life of a man I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, John Andrew Jackson. The fact that almost nobody has ever heard of him is actually part of the point. I'm trying to not just bring a little known story to the public. I'm also really interested in why, with the copious evidence we have, is that story unknown? Why have certain things in Black oral history that have survived, why haven't they made it into the white paperwork? So while I have a wonderful historical and literary tale to unfold for you, I'm also interested in the archives themselves. Each chapter is structured not as a straight chronology. I open with a document and I talk about how to read that document. Maybe it's a receipt, maybe it's a letter, maybe it's a page from a census document. So I talk about how to read that document sort of against the grain. And then I go into the story of John Andrew Jackson, in which that document will somehow figure for that episode of his life. Fortunately, too, the new press, which has been a terrific press to work with, they gave me 58 illustrations, which is just unheard of for a book like this. So it's fantastic that I have lots of illustrations scattered in. And when I was walking through the project, they commented, well, you seem to want a lot of your illustrations to be of documents. That's not usually the most sexy picture. People want photographs or paintings or images. Just showing a picture of a census page isn't a customary illustration. I was like, oh no, No, the part of the page, how we learn to look at the page, I want to empower readers to know that they can handle these documents themselves, that they can bring their own life experiences to interpreting these to find their own family histories. I really wanted to empower people to handle their own documents in a way. So that also is one of the part of the conversation I particularly look forward to tossing around with you all and with Greg after I run you through things. I'm going to try to share a screen, and it may take a couple of seconds of fumbling, but then we'll be off to the races. Let's see. Well, thank you all for coming. Can you see my blue screen? Thumbs up. Okay, good. I'll start off by I threw this word in unarchiving story. Unarchiving is nothing I've done any sophisticated theoretical, work on. It's just I wanted to throw up the phrase just to defamiliarize the notion of research and archive. I wanted to make it just a little uncomfortable, that word, that awkward word, unarchiving, just to remind you to be thinking about the paperwork that has informed your research and work over the years, and also to make you conscious of how I'm talking about paperwork and documents. I'm from Brooklyn originally, so I'm a fast talker, and I'm under a bit of a time constraint, so I'm going to go very quickly through a really complicated life, and we're going to sort of pause at a couple of key moments to see how they play out. So John Andrew Jackson was born in South Carolina, enslaved by a family known as the English family near an area known as Lynchburg, or Black Creek was sort of a region described around it. And he fell madly in love with a beautiful girl at an adjacent labor camp. And on this plantation labor camp, he married Louisa, a marriage that was not recognized by the English family. And indeed, they opposed it. They didn't approve. But nonetheless, it was a marriage for him. And they had a little daughter, Ginny. Sadly, his wife was forcibly remarried. And you can put all the horror and pain into those quotation marks with that phrase. And she was to be sent to Georgia. He was devastated, and with little Ginny as well. And he's devastated and heartbroken, but he had nothing left to lose anymore. And he flees on horseback around Christmas time of 1846, almost 150 miles to Charleston, South Carolina. This is a pretty extraordinary escape, right? Because he's quite deep inland South Carolina, but he made it. He smuggles himself aboard a Boston-bound vessel in February 1847. So those are my early years. And let me go back and show you a couple of key documents and moments of those early years. There's a sense of the inland area of Sumter, South Carolina, or Lee County. Now the county lines get moved. For those of you doing research, you know what I'm talking about. County lines never stay the same, and they cause just so many paperwork headaches. That terrible photo on the top is something I shot of the house where Louisa's enslavers lived. And the down below is an image of the now torn down house where Jackson's enslavers lived. They are different houses, although same basic construction. And here's a little tip for you. I found this deed of trust, which gave over Louisa and Ginny to a law family relative who was sort of an English and law family, who then immediately moved to Macon, Georgia. What's important about this document is where I found it, which is a deed of trust. Where would you look for something like that? Is it with wills and trusts and estates? No, it was in property records and in real estate. That area of the country, you can go to the county for real estate records, and right amid farm sales are often human trafficking documents. And here we see a woman and her little girl being taken away by another family. One of the most key documents, one of the ones which really launched, I think, this as a book project, was when I was able to find the fugitive slave ad put out by a member of the English family. Some things that are remarkable about this particular advertisement. are, by the time it was put out, which is March 27th, remember I told you he ran away around Christmas time. It took them a while to realize this wasn't a case of what we would call petit marinage, where he's going to come back. I don't think they really apprehended he had fully fled for quite a while. And their own family the English family was in some disarray at the time. So it was quite a while before Thomas English put this advertisement out. And what's really impressive about this is they note how they think he's going to Houston County, Georgia. But he was actually in Boston. They're looking totally in the wrong direction. He was free and living in Boston, trying to raise money for his family by this time. So, right. This was also an important document because it uses his name for the first time. Jackson. Was that a first name, a last name? I don't know where and how that name originated. There are a lot of mysteries about Jackson's name, but this is where we first see it. And also the phrase plausibly here, which is a common term. You see it frequently in ads for runaways. But in this particular case, Jackson, he was garrulous, he was charming, he was chatty. He talked his way into problems and out of problems all the time. People who met him all commented upon his verbal dexterity. So the idea that he would self-fashion and self-construct his own life as a plausible person, and the irony and the weight of that term sort of led me in many ways to the title of the book. So moving quickly again, he gets to Salem, Massachusetts. He starts speaking in public and raising money. He starts making allies with both white abolitionists and activists, and also Henry Highland Garnett and Black activists in Boston. So things are going well. He's beginning to get money lined up. But before anything can happen, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act has passed and enacted. This means he is no longer safe in the northern states, and he decides to have a second flight, this time to Canada, and this time a little more. The first one was entirely independent escape. This one, he does look to help from Black and white people going on what we might term the Underground Railroad. He is definitely, it's not particularly organized, but it is coordinated a little bit. He has connections, he has networks. So it's more how you imagine the Underground Railroad is this second stage of his escape. Along the way, and I will go back to this in a moment, he was assisted by Harriet Beecher Stowe in Maine, who hid him in some point in December of 1850. By spring 1851, he's in Canada, and he has heard that his first wife died. And so he takes a second wife, Julia Ann Watson Jackson, who's actually a fascinating character in her own right. Julia was also a fugitive from North Carolina. There are many letters and documents at the American Antiquarian Society and elsewhere about Jackson encountering various people to help him along the way. One of the stories I really focus my chapter on, because I think it's really little discussed in the literature, is just raising money to liberate a family member. That's hard enough, but I think people forget you're dealing with bad actors. You could send your money down there and they'll take the money and not send your people. Or what about banking? If you're a Black person in Massachusetts, you're not going to have a bank account where people can deposit your savings. You need to have guarantors. You need to have people, usually, prominent white men, collect the money on your behalf, and lawyers have to get involved. So it's a very elaborate and complicated maneuver to actually make this happen. And so how Jackson learns that system is part of a story I try to unpack. He even has people on his behalf right down south to the English family to start this negotiation, which again, with a bad faith actor, it's very complicated. And they get a letter back from an angry neighbor who's writing on on behalf of the English family, a really unkind letter, an obscenely unkind letter. But it was so awful that Jackson was able to take the clipping and sort of wave it around, and they published it in the Liberator and in some northern newspapers to show the cruelty and the casual anger of the enslavers in South Carolina who were responding in condescending vileness to Jackson. Here's a picture of the Stowe house, and there's a long story about his moments there. I think I'm going to summarize it very quickly by saying that Harriet Beecher Stowe is mentioned in Jackson's memoir. He later wrote a memoir, and he only gives her like 2 or 3 sentences saying she hid him, basically. And I looked at that and I figured, when did this happen? He's probably exaggerating. But then I realized it corresponded almost perfectly with a letter at Yale University, I mean, not unknown, but unpublished letter by Harriet Beecher Stowe to her sister Catherine. Stowe was talking about an argument she had had with a neighbor, a Reverend Upham, about the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Reverend Upham had said, well, I don't like the Fugitive Slave Act, but I'm not going to defy it. And she went back and forth with him. And here she is talking to her sister. He and I had over the tea table the other night that sort of argument, which consists of sides saying, they're not going to do it. And what would you do if a fugitive came? And Mrs. Upham laughed. And well, the next day there comes along a fugitive bound for Canada. Smythe, another neighbor, sends him right up to the professor, who takes him into his study, hears his story, gives him $1. Mrs. Upham puts in bountifully for food, and then he comes here for lodging. Now our beds were all full, and before this law passed, I might have tried to send him somewhere else. As it was, all hands in the house united in making him up a bed. So Stowe brings him in, and then she writes at some length about this encounter. She never names the individual. But towards the end, she said he was a genuine article from the old Carolina state. And there she's quoting a minstrel tune. That minstrel tune comes up later on in Jackson's life. But so what's astounding about this is we have it's the only case I know of in North America where we have a first person account. We have primary source documents from both the hider and the hidee testifying to this encounter. And I don't want to linger too much on it, but 5 weeks later, basically about 5 weeks later, Stowe had a revelation about writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And while there may be other individuals, Josiah Henson, all sorts of other people who might be models for particular characters, I argue that the moment of taking your anti-slavery activism to the personal moment of action, opening your door, bringing somebody in against the law, she had no husband in house, that's a really monumental moment of bringing a cause into your heart and into your action. And I think it's not a coincidence that a couple of weeks later, she had this revelation about what she needed to do, which was to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. But we're going to set that aside for now because this is Jackson's story, not Stowe's. I'll breeze through another couple of minutes. In 1851, he shows up at the Paris census of New Brunswick, Canada. He is fascinatingly listed by race, but his race is identified as United States, right? Whether that was some sort of guerrilla transcription on the part of the census taker, or whether it was just an offhand way they want to indicate that these people are fugitives and refugees. I love thinking about, I actually need to do some more writing about the language of migration and immigration issues and how we use that language and what doors open up for interpretation when you start using that language to look at 19th century documents about that border crossing. This is a good evidence of that. While he was in Canada, he became friends with a wonderful man named Cornelius Sparrow. Let that name linger, who was a fugitive slave himself from America and who started up restauranting business and started a business doing whitewashing or painting. This is the only business I've saw anywhere advertised in all of the city of St. John during these years. And one of the few things we know about Jackson is he worked in Canada as a whitewasher. So almost certainly worked with his friend Cornelius Sparrow. He also registered to vote while in Canada. And he must have had some sort of radicalization, some sort of, probably some sort of instruction and maybe the fundamentals of literacy. He learned to read and write as an adult. And I think it might have started in Canada. And he also began to realize that that kindly woman in Maine who had hidden him became the best-selling writer in the world. And maybe he could somehow capitalize on that. He wrote a letter to Harriet Beecher Stowe asking for her endorsement. She evidently wrote back because we know in later years he has an endorsement letter from Harriet Beecher Stowe that many people testify to having seen. That letter hasn't survived, but many people comment, oh, he carries with him a letter from Harriet Beecher Stowe. So in 1856, he goes to Britain. He gives over 50, or maybe it's more like 70 actually, independent lectures, mostly in Scotland and England, hoping to raise money to purchase other relatives. He joins the Reverend Spurgeon's huge London tabernacle. He publishes a memoir of his life using sort of one of Spurgeon's press. He sort of gets arrested in Dundee, Scotland for arguing and having a libelous encounter with somebody. And in the course of that court case being sorted out, he gets angry at Reverend Spurgeon, who he thinks didn't really come to his defense. And he publishes a pamphlet, a crazy pamphlet, where he talks about how angry he is with Spurgeon. There's that famous enormous Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. The front of the building still stands. The Nazis bombed the back of it. So the back of it is some ugly modern thing, but the front, you can get a sense of what an enormous platform this man brought up in South Carolina to be a machine for cotton picking, how far he had come and how his story and the power of his words could reach an audience like that. He published a book. At this point, I think he was functionally literate. Notice there's no sponsor who wrote it for him or editor. He's pretty much says it's by him. I suspect, again, somebody helped him somewhat, but by the late 60s, I have letters that he wrote and signed his name. So he was absolutely sort of, I know he was functionally literate. I don't think at a very high level, but I think that's an important way to how he shapes his story, which is witty and funny at times, horrifying at others, but he's really dexterous in his writing. You can really hear his voice. So it's really one of the very best ones I've read in terms of sort of quality of storytelling. You can get a real sense of it. Here's the extant copy of the pamphlet he wrote complaining about Spurgeon, who he thought had, he embezzled money that he collected on my behalf. And not only that, he has liquor in the basement, even though he's a Baptist. Who knows if he did? Jackson's just furious at Spurgeon. Indeed, this pamphlet, which I transcribe in my book, it's a little incoherent. It's like really badly written. It's sort of crazy, but which actually testifies to me that, yeah, it's really his own work. Like nobody edited that thing. It was his own furious, angry screed, and, good on him. But nonetheless, his relationship with Spurgeon was so bad, and all his patronage sort of dried up, that the moment the Civil War ended, he and Julia got on a boat and went back to the US. By late 1865, he's in Massachusetts again, working informally with the Freedmen's Bureau. I know this is a lot of info. I'm going fast, but hold on to your hats because he's moving around still. He settles in Springfield, Massachusetts. Basically, he's in New England and then South Carolina, New England and South Carolina. He's going up and down, collecting donations and bringing them down to the freedmen. And he has all these schemes and dreams, few of which come to fruition, but they tell us a great deal about Reconstruction. They tell us about hope. They tell us about violence. And they tell us about sort of public memory. Because what's astounding to me about Jackson in many ways are these final decades of his life where he's incredibly active in ways that don't fit easy labels. Here's a poster he gave that's lecturing in Massachusetts. And here it said, labored some months under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is I don't think he was ever formally working for them. So the assignment of the Freedmen's Bureau is a little loose, but he definitely was friendly with many, many officials and administrators of the Freedmen's Bureau, including O.O. Howard, the director. He speaks on slavery, miscegenation, exodusters. He'll just, and the fate of the freedmen. Most of all, he's trying to just fundraise for the survivors down in South Carolina. I think I don't have a lot of evidence, so I'm very careful when I talk about this in the book and I flesh out why I think this. But I think it's possible Louisa survived and returned from Georgia to South Carolina after the war. And when Jackson also returns to South Carolina, he now has two families. And I'm not totally clear if this has happened, but it helps explain perhaps the tragedies and how you couldn't quite say this openly, and yet how he's going between the North and the South for the rest of his life to sort of reconnect with his families in South Carolina and in New England. The gristmill scheme, to give you a sense of his audacious, bold, fearless, ridiculous persona at times, or personality. He decides he wants to buy a large tract of land which has a gristmill on it, and he wants to get people to help him fund this purchase, and he will settle maybe 40 Black families in sort of a communal utopian scheme. Right now, that's wild enough, and there are little incidents of that sort of happening here and there in the South, but he wants to buy Robert English's property. Indeed, he writes to O.O. Howard in 1868, trying to raise money to buy 1,000 acres that my master once owned, as he said. And here you have, by the way, this is, I believe, his actual handwriting. You can see it's sort of, it's clear, but it's very rounded, like sort of a relatively novice, not the world's most sophisticated writer. Other things were written for him, but I think this was probably his own handwriting. No surprise, he doesn't quite get enough money. Howard writes back and says, it's a good project, but I'm not gonna be able to donate to it, but I'll hold the money for you if you want us to sort of endorse it. But it never quite comes to be. When you go to Lynchburg today, this is where the English family house was. This little intersection is currently, this is my photograph from a few years ago. This is still growing cotton, probably owned by some international conglomerate, but it's still being used for cotton production. But the property down the road that was the English family with the grist mill, that's now the Lee County Correctional Facility, maximum security. It is the major employer for the entire region. And if you want to think about the trajectory of carceral pain of Black history, where this could have been a utopian, communal Black family self-sufficiency sort of ideal being worked out on that very land. I couldn't even get too close. This picture wasn't mine. This was taken from a newspaper, because when I tried to get too close to the site, is no surprise, it was my way was blocked in every corner. Final decades of Jackson's life. His second wife seems to have died in an asylum. He seems to go to a third wife. I'm not totally clear on that one. He has a little daughter, Elizabeth, who sort of appears on the historical record and then disappears. So I don't know if she survived, or he and Ella may have left him. I don't think he and Ella lasted very long. He also shows up living at various New Haven addresses, and I'll linger on that as one of my last stories. He buys some acres and land, and he was arrested in North Carolina. In New Haven, and here's a moment to sort of linger on notions of documentation. I talk about a methodology of community. When I was first looking for him up, I'm looking for, where was Jackson? He shows up in 1870. He and his wife are both there. He's a laborer. She's keeping house. He's from South Carolina. He's from North Carolina. And they're in what was then and now sort of a African-American working class area. It was near factories and a carriage maker and a munition. So there were jobs there in New Haven. And I sort of thought, okay, I found him in New Haven. But I lingered on the page and the page adjacent to it and the page following it. And a new kind of story came out, one which I encourage you to similarly explore. And it's by looking at the community at the page and at the relationships you have with the people around you. Because I realized on this page, Winter Street in 1870, there were people who were Black, identified as Black, born in Kentucky, Delaware, North Carolina, Maryland, and South Carolina. And the North Carolina and South Carolina are not Jackson, what I'm referencing it. In 1870, the Emancipation Proclamation had only been passed a few years before. So these individuals, there's only three possibilities. They had been free people of color in the South, which is highly unlikely, but maybe, that they had been fugitives who had escaped bondage somehow and made their way up to Connecticut, or they were people who had been enslaved and after the Emancipation Proclamation somehow by hook or by crook made their way up to New Haven, Connecticut for jobs and connections and a new life and a new future. But what's astounding about it, right, is when you go to the other pages, largely in New Haven, there's a very big free people of color have been living in Connecticut for generations. And it's on this one street. There's a cluster of these people who obviously were survivors. I don't want to use PTSD. I don't like that language. That clinicals doesn't quite seem right, but these were people who understood one another, and they're being sort of encircled and protected and sort of hidden in plain sight by the free Black community around them. They could have scattered onto different streets, but they're absolutely centered on this street and on Winter Street and some of the very adjacent places next to it. And it reminds you that a whole different story about why Jackson and Julia moved there and how we can understand people by looking at their communities can be unpacked by sort of just lingering on the pages. 1881, I found this astonishing little North Carolina newspaper tidbit. Jackson was sentenced to work on the railroad for obtaining money. He was found guilty. He was condemned to 5 years hard labor on a chain gang. That's essentially a death sentence, with the death rates being what they were. And when you consider that he was about 56 years old. Then I found he was listed in the North Carolina state records as having escaped. No details, just escaped, one word. And then listed as recaptured. Possibly escaped again. The records were unclear. I don't know. And then he shows up in Vermont. I have a long part of my book where I really unpack this, and you can follow that story in more detail. I speculate, and I have to be careful. I think what he probably did was he escaped just long enough to get some white person to send a letter north to find somebody who would vouch for him. And I believe it would have been newspaper editors in Springfield, Massachusetts, who I think stepped forward and were like, yeah, we know him. He raises money for the poor. He's the real deal. But that full story is not completely clear to me, but it's powerful. And my coda is I wanted to learn about cotton. I wanted to learn about cotton at the moment of the decade when he was picking it, what kind it was, how many times a year it would be harvested. I wanted to do a deep dive into the particularities of cotton and how that would have shaped Jackson's life and the life of his family. And so I started looking at the WPA narratives, and I came across a particularly interesting one with a Jake McLeod of Lynchburg, South Carolina. He wrote, I hear tell about one man running away from Black Creek and going to Free State, catch ride with people that used to travel, hauling cotton and things. He come back about 15 years after the war and lived in that place, adjoined to me, come back with barrels and boxes of old secondhand clothes and accumulated right smart here. Talk a good deal about how he associated with the whites. Don't know how he come run away, but they didn't catch up with him till it was too late. And then I looked at one of the last land deeds I had with Jackson, and it was adjoining the land of a Jacob McLeod. So here I had the story of Jackson, and his family name was Clavon, and I've been in touch with the descendants. The Clavon family has been wonderfully helpful in unpacking this story. There's a little street in Lynchburg named after the Clavons. That's sort of the presence of Jackson's family. And I've never found exactly where he died. Exactly that 1898 deed is, I think, the last paper trace I have of him. But his story came through to the 20th century, as Jake McLeod reminds us, and why there wasn't space in standard white history for someone like Jackson, right? But he existed through really just one generation away. My mother was born in 1936. So, that's overlapping with Jake McLeod. That's just one generation away, where people who knew Jackson and remembered him for the powerful force that he was. And that's the story I'm trying to tell and to model and showcase sort of the paperwork dreams that we have. So thank you.
That was so amazing, Susanna. I'll just start with a little bit of conversation, and of course, Krishna, jump in, and I'm sure we can bring in other folks too. This is what strikes me, and there's the astounding research, right? The hanging in there and finding the whole story. It's a micro history of America. Right? I'm just blown away. I've read this book a couple times, and I've worked with you, and I know your dexterity in doing it. But there's no reason you necessarily were going to be able to find the whole scope of his life like you did. Can you explain what it took to do that?
Well, okay, shout out to some of the databases at Harvard. I'll say that right there. That library access made a lot of difference for me. Remember, a lot of universities cannot subscribe to the data. We can talk, and I will talk with great love and happiness about the amount of digitization that is coming through every day. But right, lots of institutions still cannot get through those, get access to those. So I'm always very grateful for the funding and the opportunities I've been given that allowed me sort of a way in to that. Also, I mean, some of my skills are better now than they were when I began this project. Took 12 years. When I first began this, I was not, well, many of you, I'm sure, you know what I'm talking about, ancestry.com, right? It's a beast. I do a lot of work there. And it changes every day. You can look something up one day and you won't find it. Then 3 months later, you look something up, or a year later and it appears. New things are being added every day, but also things aren't showing up that used to show up. So I've gotten much better at ancestry.com, which is really the core of so much of my research. Also, all the different newspaper interfaces. I think I lost track of your question, Greg.
Yeah, so I just the way that the part of the work or time that it takes for uncovering, like this story could have been Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? And it could have been that. But no, it's the prison industrial complex. It's the uh, innovation. It's a love story, a broken love story, a broken family story. The way somebody, there's just it's such a complete history, a micro history. So the question was what it took to get to that history, right? And you were unspooling that beautifully.
Well, maybe this is, and again, this is something we can all think about, is modeling the moments of frustrations and finding some beauty in them. So for example, and I know you do this too, Greg, when I was looking in Canada, I had very little information about the 6 years that Jackson spent in Canada. I had that wonderful voting record. I knew he had been married. I found those in Canadian archival documents to verify that. And I found his census record indicating he had crossed over as a refugee. And then I had like 3 sentences from him in his book, and that's all I could find. And rather than give up, again, I tried to do methodology of community, and I went, who is he with? And I looked at the census document. Who are the names on the page with him? What can we learn about them? And not just because it's useful, but because we're all connected, and people were always all connected. And so that's how I started unpacking the story of Cornelius Sparrow, who had such a beautiful name, right? But he was a fugitive, and he was involved in a big law case in Massachusetts, and so who had suddenly disappeared and showed up in Canada. And in Canada, he became a very prominent restaurateur. And so I was able to build out this life of Cornelius Sparrow just to sort of flesh out Jackson's life. And then I realized, wait, he ran a whitewashing business. Surely there is no question. And then you start reading the newspapers broadly. And if I'm reading just looking for whitewashing and Jackson and Cornelius Sparrow, I'm being efficient looking for my information. But what you really end up doing, and this happens to all of us, right? Organically, you start reading everything else in that Canadian paper, and you start getting a sense of what was this sort of, maritime city. A lot of Irish famine immigrants are arriving in there. So the black refugees were now competing with all these Irish immigrants of the late 1840s who were landing in St. John as often their first stop before they got to New York or Boston. What was it like there? So you start out looking for a specific thing, and if you let yourself stop when you get frustrated, your story ends there. But if you build out relationships and you look more broadly, a whole richer and more real story, right, I think untwines.
So how about the way you wrote the book? So I remember when we were working together I love the advice that I felt very confident was good advice you didn't follow, and it totally makes your book wonderful. You write, rather, each chapter here focuses on one particular telling historical document that frames a perspective not merely upon Jackson's life activities, but upon the notions of what can and cannot be recorded. And that's really the signposting that carries us through a narrative, which we can talk about the beautiful way you create narrative from this. But tell me about you held fast to that. That's an innovative way to write the book. And I know from our conversations while you were working on that was deeply a part of your mission. So I think it works so beautifully in a way that I could never see while we were working to collaborating when you were writing this. So I just want to know more about it. I think it would just work so beautifully.
Well, I'll shout out to some of my editors at New Press who were willing to let me use this slightly unconventional structure. If I just wanted to write a regular biography, I could have, but I did want to showcase these documents. And there was some pushback. And sometimes, again, all of you in your writing projects, sometimes you get really good advice, but it's not right for you. And so when Greg was like, Susanna, you sure you want to stop? You're like stopping and starting your story, and you're telling things a little bit out of order by throwing these documents at the beginning. And it was really good advice. It just wasn't good advice for me for that at that moment. What I needed was to launch from those documents. One of the documents I use is a memoir written by a man named Lowry, who was brought up enslaved on a plantation labor camp adjacent to the English family, and talks about events that Jackson also talks about, and talks about some of the people, including probably Jackson's father, that Lowry knew. So, I mean, I was like, I've got to linger on this story of Lowry and the strange tone of it and how nostalgic it is almost in a way that Jackson's is so furious and bitter. And what do we do with that? In ways, I think it illustrates that, well, Greg, you too, we both come from English. And I do historical work. I am not a trained historian. I do historical work, but my fundamental questions are about how we remember, how we tell stories, how we listen. And I think that infused why I shaped my book the way I did.
Well, Krishna, I want to make sure that I allow you time. I have some other questions, but please, Krishna.
For people in the audience, if you wish to comment or ask a question, please raise your hand. But Greg, why don't you continue and we'll improvise. I may have a question or two as well.
Certainly. So the next thing that's very, very interesting to me, because it's something not every this is an academic book that is published by the New Press. It's covered in the Wall Street Journal. There's a narrative challenge to writing a work for a larger audience than to meet the demands of a trained professional audience, but then to write it in a way that we have storytelling, right? And how did you get there? I think you just do it so beautifully. As somebody who, and even the way you set out these archival documents, that's what I actually love, because there's a lot of work that a reader doesn't know and sometimes doesn't even need, they would even ask the question of how you tell the story. But you're unspooling that and showing the seams and the labor to construct it, and it's a real mission of the book. I'm just curious how you made that journey to writing it for a larger audience and making it also just an extraordinarily compelling narrative.
Well, thank you so much again for those kind words. This is the kind of conversation actually Greg and I have had sort of behind the scenes over the years about how do you, I'm accustomed to traditional academic writing to other scholars. So this was my first work for a general audience, and it didn't come easy and it didn't come naturally. It did not come naturally. I did have different people I shared my work with, and so I'm in a writing group with Greg, but also I've been sharing work over the years with two women who are writing biographies. And we constructed a couple of little challenges with one another. We were all in this situation as academics, yet trying to tell life stories to a bigger audience. And one of the things I remember once we said was, okay, let's all try to do something about the weather. Let's make sure we all have some scene in our book somewhere, a couple of paragraphs where we talk about how the weather affected some incident or person. And that was actually a terrific reminder. I remember I went and looked up the weather on the day that Jackson's boat arrives in Boston. Was it snowing? Was it sunny? What was it like? And that just sort of gave me a moment to linger on making something real. Other little exercises we developed. I remember we did once about a missed connection. Is there someone, can you put a couple of paragraphs in your book about a missed connection? So, we had a couple of these little moments to think about. Another way was how much suspense do you want to put in, and how, so at one moment with Jackson, he's on a train in England and he's going between, I think, Manchester and Liverpool. He's speeding around on trains to give lectures and public talks all over northern England. And I thought, well, you know what Jackson must have been, so grateful for the speed and the opportunity that these trains gave him and Julia as they traveled. Little could he know that not 10 years, 20 years later, he would be on a chain gang building, digging out railway tracks in Western North Carolina. So I try, adding these little bits of sort of suspense and foreshadowing without being too heavy-handed about it. And Greg, another thing I know we did talk about in our group a little bit that I did was sort of rhetorical questions. What I don't want to say, he felt X, because I don't know. But, and I know you do this a little bit too, Greg, would he have felt? Couldn't he? Surely he would have been frightened, or, so giving some caveat with care and empathy and respect, but also not pulling back from the human nature of we are all humans, and we can imagine he would have been scared at the situation. We don't want to, so that's another thing. We're trying to make it accessible to me. and empathetic for general readers to be in that moment without being, without being irresponsible in a scholarly way.
It's just lovely knowing those challenges as somebody who tries to do that work and to see you just beautifully dance. And the reason why it matters is just not you being very good at the work. It's Jackson's story is so mishandled in our historical past. He's this extraordinarily important person who carries all these parts of our history that's been silenced, and that work that you're doing and carrying him forward is just profound. I see Karen Schiff has a question, so I'm going to ask to unmute Karen and see if we can hand it over to you for your question. I'm going to do that right now, or if somebody else more technically. Karen?
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for taking my question. And Susanna, it's lovely to see you. Congratulations on the project. It's fascinating. And I want to ask about the moment you talked about in the Canadian document where Jackson's race is noted as United States for reasons that relate to a different project. And I'm thinking about just trying to unpack that some more. I wonder if you can speculate, like I'm thinking about how another country perhaps regards the US at this moment relative to the nomenclature of race, or is this acknowledging that there is debate about the nomenclature of race at this moment, or just saying, oh, the US has just a race problem and we don't want to like implicate him in some way by using a word that's going to get him in trouble, or like how do you make sense of that?
Oh, that's a great question. And Karen's a colleague I haven't seen for many years, so lovely to see you, Karen. Thanks for your question. Well, one thing I try to linger on is actually, again, things weren't so clear cut. You want to think Underground Railroad, you escape to Canada, happy ever after. Well, remember, there are still laws about crossing into other countries, and they don't have, passport regulations the way we do, but still he was there under illegal circumstances. And Canada, you can't get too romantic about it. It was a British territory at that time. It was under British rule at that time. And there had been, not a lot, but there were a couple of horrifying cases of enslaved fugitives who had made it to Canada, who were then sent back because of their crimes. Their crimes being, in one case, a guy had a jacket and a watch that were determined to be his enslavers. So therefore he's guilty of theft, and he was a criminal and needed to be returned. And so he was sent over to Detroit, where, I don't know, he was never heard from again. So the legality of these, fugitives was tenuous. And there were sympathizers in Canada, white and black sympathizers, but it was hard always to connect up with those. There wasn't a big abolitionist movement in St. John, for example. I did a deep dive and really couldn't find many, activists. They maybe quietly people were supportive. But so when I look at that, one theory, again, I play this out in my book in some length, is I wonder if there's what you might call guerrilla transcription, where the census taker is the census taker is a person who is making a decision at that moment. What are they going to do with these black refugees? They've had free people. There are many people of African descent living in this area of the Maritimes from the American Revolutionary era, things like that. But this particular generation, suddenly in 1850, you have all these people crossing over. What do you do with them? You don't want to call attention to their presence and have them returned or remanded or get them in sort of legal imbroglio. On the other hand, did I pronounce imbroglio? I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, but so it's a fascinating moment. They were also identified as black in another like marginal thing on the page. So it wasn't a secret that they were people of color, but officially race was the United States, which tells you a little bit about the complications of, legality of people without papers. Again, I like using this modern language because it defamiliarizes us with those, easy Underground Railroad stories. This is something very different at play.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Ophira Davis. And she writes, thank you. Can you talk about Jackson's verbosity and his success Also, can you discuss Uncle Tom's Cabin and Jackson's real life?
Oh, thank you. And thank you for saying fantastic, Ophira. That's sweet of you. Let me talk about his verbosity. Oh man. Okay. So the thing that first drew me to the project was reading this little known narrative and almost laughing at some of his asides. At one point, he writes in his narrative, well, I was accosted in Charleston by people saying, who do you belong to? And he wrote, I belong in South Carolina, which is a nonsensical response. And then he wrote, it's none of their business. I was trying to belong to myself. You get this moment of this sort of bravado of his comments. And then I started finding, his Enslaver talks about his plausibility and the way he'll speak his way out of problems. You have Harriet Beecher Stowe saying how charming he would laugh and joke and tell stories with his children. Later on, he becomes a public speaker. And I read See, I don't know, his speeches were not written down. What I have are many, 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 many journalists paraphrasing them. And uniformly, they say, oh, he's really a fun speaker and he's a good singer. And he kept us, captivated. And, some of them liked him less than others. Some of them say he has heavy dialect. Some of them say he doesn't. But I have all these people paraphrasing him and then saying what a great public speaker he was. And then I have transcripts of court cases when he was in Scotland. I told you he got hauled into court for insulting somebody and blah. And that too, you could see his defense is very complicated. So you get a real sense of his way to talk his way out of problems, which, he was a little bit, maybe a little bit of a hustler. I think he was largely honest, but I think maybe occasionally he lined his own pockets with the money he collected. He was accused of being a fraud many times. And for the most part, I have receipts of barrels of food that were donated. I have receipts of land that he purchased and then turned back over to Massachusetts lawyers. So for the most part, he kept his promises. He was who he said he was. But his verbal dexterity was always part of his story and part of the reason that drew me to him. As for discussing Uncle Tom's Cabin, again, I don't love the title of my book. I wish Jackson's name had been in the title. I find it a little frustrating that it didn't play out that way. And it's centering Uncle Tom's Cabin. But obviously, that's the hook that sort of builds out a story for many people. He did not make a career out of boasting about his relationship with Stowe. I think that's important. He didn't ever say, I am Uncle Tom. If anything, a couple of journalists say, oh yeah, he referenced Dread. He seemed to talk about the book Dread that was really big in the 1856, 1857. He had obviously was familiar with the story. And he seemed to say, I'm more of a Dread character, or I knew people just like Dread. So he's conflating his life oddly with Dread more than with Uncle Tom's Cabin. But there's no question that he did carry that letter from Stowe in England. Later years, he had that huge break with Spurgeon, who was a very big religious figure. And I think that shattered Jackson's reputation. And I think that also meant he was no longer really eager to talk about Spurgeon, his big patron, or Harriet Beecher Stowe. So in later years, I think he might have commented on it, but he wasn't coasting on it. Unlike Josiah Henson and some other people who built careers out of having their rather, tight or loose connections to Harriet Beecher Stowe and who claimed to be inspiration. So again, Josiah Henson's a great character and a fascinating man with a rich, important life, but it's just a separate story from someone like Jackson.
Related to Karen Schiff's question and your answer, Cam Teo writes, as a Canadian citizen of color with roots in the southern U.S., we also have a history of slavery and segregation, Canadian exceptionalism, i.e., Canadians are better than Americans in terms of race. It's a thing. Do you have a comment on that, or?
Well, no, I think that's a very rich and complicated comment, and I appreciate it. In New Brunswick, particularly, people associate fugitive slaves with having fled to sort of Ontario, southern Ontario, or to have gone to and sort of the New Dawn settlements, or then there's a good group in Nova Scotia of people who settled there. And people don't really look at the city of St. John, but St. John would not let people of color work in the maritime industry, where it's a maritime city. Everybody's either building boats or in the fishing, or like if that entire industry was banned, the only reason a Black person in the city in the 1850s and through early 1860s could have a job is if it was in like domestic service or was running a restaurant, things like that. So it's shockingly racist. That's why poor Cornelius Sparrow managed to run a restaurant and a painting business. But Jackson really had no opportunities there. I think he saw there was a real ceiling on anything he could do and be. So despite, yay, he got to register to vote, he wasn't able to live a full life in Canada. And I think that is really important. And I'm glad you raised it. Canada is a fraught history in different ways from the United States, for sure.
Susanna, I was really interested in the way in which the historical record is trying to damn Jackson as inappropriately seeking money, right? Even when he's arrested in North Carolina, that's the thing. He seems to have money, and a black man in North Carolina should not be traveling with money, is what it appears, and he's arrested for that. And your research seems to show time and time again that there's a record that he was um, doing the labor to really try to help people, and that balance is just so powerful to the emotional story of a man who is taking all these risks and caring for others, and never stopped, right? He's going to escape the chain gang and continue his work, right? So I was just curious, as your reflection as somebody who has looked so closely at the material and this doubt about Jackson's honesty, which you don't hide, right? Because the records have this continuing nagging doubt, even whether or not he was trying to gain money to free his first wife from slavery, or if that was true or not. Right, so you're balancing all this, and it's at the heart, I think, of the story. And I just love to see how you've reflected about that after working on this.
Yeah, I can make this sort of my final thoughts. One of the great gifts of people who do work with historical narratives of bondage, of captivity, is that there was a spectacular onus on these narratives to be true. There have been some frauds that nearly sunk the entire American anti-slavery movement. And as a result, like, people who were enslaved knew they would be fact-checked, right? And so when you actually start reading these stories, I've built my career out of just reading these stories and authenticating them, because people spoke truth in great detail. Maybe they made mistakes in spelling, or they got some details wrong, but their stories are verifiable now in a modern age in a way they couldn't have been in the 19th century. You know, I can dip in out of census data across state lines that nobody could have done in the 1860s. So, I mean, there's that sort of advantage of veracity. Also, I mean, I didn't even share with you, there was some jackass in New Haven, Connecticut, some white dude who spent his own money putting out an ad saying, "Just FYI, John Andrew Jackson is an imposter. Don't give him money." Well, I have other people in Massachusetts, around Springfield, who are saying we're collecting barrels of crackers and food donations and farm tools at this pier that Jackson's taking by boat down from New York and then down to Charleston, South Carolina for distribution. You know, I mean, so you have many people verifying that he is doing what he's doing. And again, I do have actual receipts from the Freedmen's Bureau of donations, but you do have regular challenges. A black man who is educated and, you know, self-educated, but who is literate and witty and funny and worldly, right? He's really experienced now to show up and is not, they don't know what to do with him, you know.
Susanna, thank you for writing this story of a wonderful life. It's beautifully written and so well told, despite all the archival limits that you came up against. So I suggest that we all get this book and read through it. It's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. And hey, I'm willing to speak to anybody about the book on Zoom or drop by in person. So if you have any opportunities, you need someone to talk about the book, I'm there for you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.